The genesis of this actually came when I was sitting on our budget committee, which is sort of a thankless task. And
thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Let's get that out of the way, right?
I did some background research to prepare for this, and noticed that the percentage of our university funding here that was directed specifically towards teaching and research had declined over the last decade or so. And I wasn't able to get a good answer to this when I raised it. So thinking to myself, oh, well, let's see if I can come up with an answer myself. This basically shows what trends over the last, from 2000 to 2013 of university funding as a percentage, government funding as a percentage of total. So government funding has been declining. If you were to go back a few decades, so 2000 was 60%, go back a few decades and it's significantly higher, 78% government funding representative of universities. In Nova Scotia, these are Atlantic provinces, Newfoundland, even before they had oil, was a lot devoted to funding their university system, a lot more than we have in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia right now, we are the second lowest, so just under 50% of our university funding comes from government sources. In Ontario, they're lower than we are. But there's a lot of variety going on among the different provinces, with Quebec and Newfoundland sort of taking the lead, and there's been some shift there as well. So there's my research question. How does the level of government funding affect internal allocation for universities, affect their internal allocation of their budgets? And the hypothesis here is coming from literature that looks at providing services either privately versus publicly. So in what sense? So in economics, you know, we've typically looked at private enterprise being a more efficient way, and it's the profit motive that's driving firms, individual operations to be efficient, to cut their costs, to serve customers in a better way as they're trying to attract customers. But there are some industries that function a little bit differently, that the service levels are relatively standard, and that are somewhat providing universally. So if we look at healthcare funding, for example, in the United States, despite having some of the lowest healthcare outcomes this is prior to Obamacare, having some of the lowest healthcare outcomes in the OECD, they spend by far the largest percentage of their GDP on healthcare. And the reasoning for this is that there's so much resources that are actually devoted towards the managing of the system, such as through insurance and advertising. And so a lot of spending is going towards functions that are not actually directed towards providing people health care. If we come back to university systems, so the hypothesis that I've taken is that as governments reduce their funding, the universities have to rely increasingly on attracting revenue from students, from more private sources. And this means that they have to devote more funding towards advertising, public relations, and marketing, and then student services as well. And if you're going to devote more resources to that, at least in a percentage way, you've got to take resources from somewhere else. So this is resources that are potentially taken away from teaching and research. There are different, in the business literature, there are different approaches to university budgeting. I've got the STAR by, this is sort of taking an economic approach to this. This is a goal-oriented rationality. Basically, search the university or rational organizations trying to maximize its set objectives, given their environmental and resource constraints. And in this case, it would be rational for universities and administrations to adjust their approach to their budgets depending on the constraints that they face. And if the government has cut their funding, then one of those constraints, they've got to find ways of attracting students. There are other approaches, principal agent theory and political power. This is sort of what Canadian Association of University Teachers would accuse university administrations of sort of call it a power grab, if you will, from taking away from faculty towards university administrations. That's not the approach that I'm taking, but I'm not saying it doesn't happen either. And then there's institutional. Universities derive their legitimacy from conformity to social norms, budgeting following a set of socially acceptable practices modified by internal relationships. So we perhaps like to think that we are governed by our professional norms, and rather than sort of a business incentive model that as university professors, these social norms are what cause us to be devoted and work hard and do a diligent job in teaching and our research. But I'm looking at this goal-oriented, so a rational decision to a change in the environment that administrations have been making. In terms of, so I've developed a econometric model. I won't go to, or statistical model. That's left or done? That's left. Okay. All right, well, fair enough. Okay, so I've developed this model. Data is very hard to get. Most of it comes from Canadian Association of University budget officers, and I went and grabbed data, and then went back and it was password protected, and then I went and tried. It was gone for a while, and then I went back and I managed to get it. So I've been grabbing data as I can, as it either gets protected or not, and I've managed to come up with this. So I've got a dependent variable that is essentially structured and non-sponsored research as a percentage of operating expenditure. And I've got independent variables, government percentage of operating income. So this is essentially testing my hypothesis. And then we've got a set of control variables. So one is based on scale, and couldn't get data on number of students going back for my entire timeline. So the best looking at scale is the total operating expenditure. And that's included because there have been some studies that show that economies of scale do exist in university operations, but so do diseconomies of scale. So it usually works average costs at university per student. You just think of it working as a U. They decline until roughly the size of about 10,000 students, and then they start going up. So I thought perhaps those efficiencies are affecting the percentage of funding that's going towards teaching and research. Then I've got some regional dummies of, so the base is Atlantic or Maritime, and Quebec, Ontario, and the West. And since I've got pooled data, so I've got, what do I have, 28 primary undergraduate universities across 4 time periods. So for those of you who do regression type stuff, so I've got pooled time series cross-sectional data. So I've got some dummies there. So a few nods with the regression stuff. So this is a pooled analysis. The random effects models create basically the same results.
Can you explain dummies?
Yeah.
I have an image, you don't want to.
Yeah, so so a dummy is a variable that allows you to insert qualitative aspects to an empirical model.
Okay.
So you either take on a 0 or a 1, and so the 0 in this model would essentially be Atlantic Canadian universities, and then if you've got Quebec, that be 0 for all when it's not Quebec, and one for Quebec, and then a one in another column if it's Ontario, a one in another column if it's a university in the West. Okay. I'm going to skip, so there you've got a bunch of descriptive statistics. We can look at that, and simply because a picture tells 1,000 words, I'll go straight to the picture. I'll go back to the data
If you could describe
in a set. Yes, I will. Yeah. Okay, so this is essentially showing the relationship between instruction and non-sponsored research as a percentage of operating expenditure and versus government percentage of operating income. And essentially says there's a positive relationship. And a pretty decent relationship there. So if we look at the slope of this line, we're at about 0.22. So what this is saying is that when governments, let's look at it in the opposite direction, because this is mostly what happens. When governments decrease the percentage of the funding that goes to university, that they give to university, that results in a decrease in the funding, in the percentage of operating expenditure that universities devote to teaching and research. Okay. And of course, lots of statistics, so including all the control variables. We can't just draw a line, and we have to control all of those sorts of things. If anyone's interested in that, they can look. A lot of that extra funding, although not all of it, is going towards student services. So this has the same horizontal axis. So government's percentage of operating expenditure. So if governments decrease their operating expenditure, the percentage of funding that goes towards universities, student services, funding towards student services at universities is increasing. All of these results are highly significant at the 99% level. I just put these into perspective. So we consider an average size undergraduate institution. Mount St. Vincent, we're relatively small. So the average size undergraduate university in Canada has total operating expenditure of around 82 million. And average government funding as a percentage of total operating income is 58%. We're significantly lower than that in Nova Scotia. So government funding of this average institution would be just over $47 million. Suppose the government cuts funding by 10%, and the university makes up the difference by increasing tuition and fees. So this means that government funding its percentage of operating income will decrease by 5.8. Calculating from the results that we have, this would result, or be associated with, as I should say, teaching and research expenditure as a percentage of total operating expenditure would decrease by just over $1 million. And we may say, oh, it's just $1 million, but that's significant. $1 million is a significant amount, but it's not this enormous amount. What are the policy implications of this? The main policy implications, the governments need to recognize that when they cut funding, that's going to influence the decisions of university administrations, and it may be influencing in a way that they don't intend. And in fact, they're trying to promote efficiencies. The idea is, oh, we'll cut funding and that'll make things more efficient. Well, what are you making more efficient? And instead of directing those funds towards teaching and research, which should be our prime objective in university, universities are being forced to go out and try to attract students. And so it's shifting university away from a teaching and research model towards, and not that we're not still doing that, but more towards a consumer model. And if you're going to do that consumer model, then you have to shift your priorities towards attracting and retaining those students. And that may involve other types of spending away from teaching and research. Now, this is not meant, so maybe when they do this, if they're one, they should, we all would like them to say, like, put the funding back in. But if they're gonna have these restrictions, they may want to provide some restrictions on how universities use that funding. Now, this is not meant to be. I'm not criticizing our administration or university administrations in general. Okay, and that's the model that I've taken. And this is a rational response to the environment that universities administrations find themselves. And so, we have to. It's not necessarily an inefficient use of funds as well. So in the industrial organization literature, and with I work, we talk about advertising in sort of two types. So there's persuasive advertising, and there's informative advertising. Informative advertising, that type of advertising that provides potential students with real information that's going to help them, okay, I should go to the Mount because this is the best place for me to do my studies. That's very useful. If it's persuasive advertising, that is directed towards just slogans, trying to convince people to come for whatever type of reasons, then we might consider that sort of as wasteful. And if universities are Dow and St. Mary's and Mount St. Vincent, if we're involved in a lot of these types of persuasive advertising, then we may just be just a zero-sum game, working against each other without any sort of gain. So I'll leave it at that.